Imagine walking away from your graduation, your family, and your entire future because a guy at a bar told you that your life depended on it. Not because he had a gun to your head, but because he convinced you that he was the only thing standing between you and a professional hit squad. This isn't a spy thriller. It's the lived reality of people who lost a decade of their lives to a man who never once had to lock a door to keep them prisoner. In 1993, Newport, Shropshire was a quiet place, the kind of town where the local pub is the center of the universe. At the Swan Pub, Robert Hendy-Freegard wasn't just a barman, he was a performer. He had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. He was charming, sure, but it was deeper than that. He had glibness, that slick, superficial charisma that psychopaths use like a master key. He set his sights on 3 students, John Atkinson, Sarah Smith, and Maria Hendy. He didn't start with a big lie. He started with a drip, a mention of special projects, a hint at a secret life, until he finally dropped the bomb. He told them he was an undercover MI5 agent. At the time, the threat of the IRA was a constant, buzzing anxiety in the back of everyone's mind in the UK. Robert leaned into that fear. He told these students that their roommate was linked to a cell, and because of that connection, they were all marked for elimination. To a 20-year-old, this sounded terrifyingly plausible. He didn't just tell them they were in danger, he gave them loyalty tests. He once convinced John to let him hit him in the face to toughen him up for the life of a fugitive. This is where the psychological hook sinks in. It's called coercive control. He created a reality where the outside world was a minefield, and he was the only map. He convinced them to go on the run, moving them from one dingy apartment to another. While these 3 were huddled in freezing rooms, sharing a single tin of beans, and jumping at every car that drove past, Robert was living like a king. Let's talk about the numbers, because they are staggering. Over the years, Robert extracted nearly $1 million from his victims and their families. To put that in perspective, in the mid-90s, that was enough to buy 10 average American homes in cash. He didn't spend it on state secrets. He spent it on silver BMWs, $7,000 Rolex watches, and Savile Row suits. He was a predator who used the money of the poor to dress like the elite. He stayed in 5-star hotels, while Sarah Smith was essentially kept in a safe house that was really just a hole-in-the-wall flat where she wasn't allowed to look out the windows. For 10 years, she didn't see her family. Her father, desperate to keep her safe, kept sending money to the man he thought was her handler. It was a masterclass in isolation. He didn't just steal their money, he stole their identity. The silent witness in this story isn't a piece of DNA or a fingerprint. It's a series of mundane objects, a stack of fake business cards, a collection of cheap hotel receipts, and the hollowed-out look in a victim's eyes when they finally realize the secret mission they've been on for 3,600 days was actually just a cruel, expensive joke. But every lie has a shelf life. As Robert's appetite for control grew, so did his risks. He started targeting more people, spinning more plates, and moving across borders. He thought he was untouchable, the invisible hand pulling the strings of a dozen different lives. But he made one mistake. He assumed that once you break a person's spirit, they stay broken forever. He didn't count on the fact that sometimes the most terrified person in the room is the one who eventually has nothing left to lose. And in a small airport in London, a single phone call was about to start a clock that even Robert couldn't stop. Imagine being 20 years old, sitting in a pub, and a charismatic guy tells you that your roommate is a double agent. It sounds like a bad movie, but for 3 college students in 1993, this was the moment their reality began to fracture. Robert Hendy-Freegard didn't use a weapon to hijack their lives. He used a story. He told them he was an undercover MI5 agent investigating an IRA cell on campus. He convinced them that because of their association with him, their lives were now in danger. This wasn't just a quick hustle. This was the birth of a labyrinth that would last for over a decade. Robert didn't just want their money. He wanted to own their sense of self. He forced these students to undergo tests. He'd make them move from one safe house to another, often sleeping in cars or on park benches, while he stayed in high-end hotels. He convinced Sarah Smith, one of his longest-running victims, to go on the run for 10 years. Think about that. 10 years of your life, the entire span of your 20s, spent hiding in plain sight because you think a shadow organization is trying to end your life. Robert's psychological blueprint was terrifyingly simple. Isolate, then dominate. He'd find a crack in someone's life, loneliness, a need for adventure, or a simple desire to do good, and he'd wedge himself in. Once he had them isolated from their families, he became their only source of truth. He managed to siphon away nearly $1.5 million over the years. To put that into perspective, that's about the cost of 4 average family homes in the US fully paid off. But while his victims were scraping by on bread and water, believing they were on a mission, Robert was out buying 7 BMWs and a fleet of Rolex watches. The most chilling part of his psychology was the lack of a tell. Usually, a liar has a moment of hesitation, a flicker of guilt. Not Robert. He possessed the kind of superficial charm that could convince you the sky was green if it suited his narrative. He lived in a state of constant performance. To his victims, he was a hero making a sacrifice. To the world, he was a high-flying businessman. In reality, he was a bartender from a small town who found out he had a genius-level talent for cruelty. But even a master architect leaves a paper trail. The silent witness in this case wasn't a physical trace of struggle, but something much more mundane, a car rental agreement and a credit card trail that led back to a woman Robert was currently dating in the United States. Her name was Kim Adams. He was using the same script on her, promising a life of mystery and protection. What Robert didn't know was that Kim's family wasn't like the others. They weren't going to let her disappear into the fog of his lies without a fight. They contacted the authorities, and for the first time, Robert's invisible world began to collide with the actual one. A joint operation between Scotland Yard and the FBI began to close in. They didn't have a body or a smoking gun, but they had a pattern of destroyed lives. They set a trap at an airport, using Kim as the bait. It was a high-stakes gamble. If Robert sensed even a hint of a setup, he'd vanish again, and the women still under his control might never be found. As Robert walked toward Kim in the terminal, his head held high, looking every bit the successful agent he claimed to be. He had no idea that the labyrinth was about to collapse. The hunters were now the hunted. But as the handcuffs clicked shut, the investigators realized something horrifying. Catching the man was the easy part. The real challenge would be convincing his victims that the war they had been fighting for a decade never actually existed. And for one victim in particular, the truth was about to be more devastating than the lie ever was. High, looking every bit the successful agent he claimed to be, he had no idea that the labyrinth was about to collapse. The hunters were now the hunted. But as the handcuffs clicked shut, the investigators realized something horrifying. Catching the man was the easy part. The real challenge would be convincing his victims that the war they had been fighting for a decade never actually existed. And for one victim in particular, the truth was about to be more devastating than the lie ever was. For people like Sarah, the realization wasn't a relief. It was a total psychological breakdown. Imagine spending 10 years, or exactly 3,650 days, looking over your shoulder every single hour. Every car that slows down on the street is a threat. Every knock at the door is a potential ending. You've given up your family, your career, and your sanity to stay alive in a shadow war. And then, a detective in a suit tells you there was no war. There was no IRA. There was only a man who wanted your money and your soul. The financial toll was staggering, but even that doesn't capture the scale of the theft. Over a decade, Freegard drained nearly $1 million from his victims. To put that into perspective, that's enough to buy a fleet of 20 luxury sedans or a massive estate in the countryside outright. But while Freegard was wearing designer suits and driving fast cars, his victims were living in squalor. They were often sharing a single room in a rundown flat, eating cheap canned goods, and waiting for orders that would never come. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a total erasure of the self. In the interrogation room, the mask didn't slip. Freegard didn't break. He didn't show remorse because, neurologically speaking, he likely couldn't. His psychological profile shows a complete absence of empathy, a textbook case of a predatory personality. He viewed these people as objects, tools to be used until they were broken. When the police finally cornered him, he looked at them with the same cold, calculated indifference he used on his victims. In 2005, it seemed like the story had finally reached its conclusion. A jury found him guilty of kidnapping by fraud, and the judge handed down a life sentence. The headlines called him the most manipulative man in Britain. But the legal system has its own blind spots. 2 years later, in 2007, an appeals court overturned his kidnapping convictions. The reason was a technicality that still haunts the investigators today. Under the law at that time, kidnapping required physical force or the threat of it. The court ruled that because the victims voluntarily followed him, even though that choice was built on a mountain of lies, it didn't technically meet the legal definition. He walked out of prison after serving only a fraction of his time. He was a free man, a ghost back in the system. And that's the most chilling part of this story. He didn't stop. Fast forward to the present day, and the cycle is repeating. New names, new stories, but the same predator. In recent years, families have come forward describing the exact same patterns. Loved ones disappearing, cutting off all contact, and slowly being drained of their assets. One high-profile case involved a woman named Sandra, who vanished from her family's life, only for them to discover she was with a man using a different alias, but the same tactics. He's currently back on the radar of international authorities, but like a digital virus, he keeps finding new vulnerabilities in human trust. The case of Robert Hendy-Freegard isn't just a true crime story, it's a warning. It shows us that you don't need a weapon to take a life. You just need a convincing story and a person who wants to believe in something bigger than themselves. He's still out there, somewhere, perhaps sitting in a bar, listening, watching, and waiting for the next person to walk through the door. The handcuffs may have clicked once, but for the man who lives in the shadows, the game never truly ends.